In the spring of 1945, a man stood inside a castle on a mountainside and watched his family lose almost everything they had spent 700 years building. His name was Franz Joseph II. He was the reigning prince of Liechtenstein, the head of one of the oldest noble houses on the continent, and on paper, he was about to become almost worthless. Across the border, in newly liberated Czechoslovakia, a set of government orders was being signed that would strip his family of more than 1,600 square kilometers of land, castles, forests, farms, palaces that had been in the family for centuries, an area roughly 10 times the size of his own country, gone with a stamp and a signature. The family would lose close to 80% of everything it owned. By then, the other great crowns of Europe had already gone dark. The Russian Romanovs had been shot in a cellar. The German Kaiser was dying in exile in a borrowed house in the Netherlands. The Austrian Habsburgs, the very family the Liechtensteins had served for centuries, had been stripped of their titles and shown the door. From the outside, this looked like one more dynasty going down, just a slower, quieter fall than the rest. Within 20 years, this prince would be forced to sell a genuine Leonardo da Vinci painting, one of the rarest objects on earth, simply to keep the household running. What nobody knew at the time was that this nearly broke prince was sitting on the one thing that would turn his family into the richest royal house in Europe. Not the British, not the Dutch, not the Spanish, Liechtenstein. And it would make his descendants the only crowned family on the continent who would never again have to ask their people for a single franc. This is the story of how a family that lost almost everything became the one European monarchy that doesn't run on taxpayer money, and how the prince who lives in that castle today funds his entire reign out of his own pocket, while every other throne in Europe sends the bill to its citizens, Vienna. The year is 1699. The House of Liechtenstein is already ancient. The first member shows up in the written record in the 12th century, and the family takes its name from a castle near Vienna, not from any country. There was no country yet. For roughly 500 years, before there was ever a place called Liechtenstein, there was a family called Liechtenstein, and they were rich. Genuinely, enormously rich. They had served the Habsburg emperors for generations as advisors, governors, and soldiers, and they had been paid in the only currency that mattered back then, land. The family owned vast estates across Moravia, Bohemia, Silesia, and Lower Austria. They were one of the wealthiest houses in the entire Holy Roman Empire, rivaled by almost no one. And yet, for all that money, there was one door that stayed closed to them. The family had the princely title. What they did not have was a seat in the imperial diet, the assembly where the real political weight of the empire sat, and the reason was a technicality. To hold a seat, you needed land that you held directly from the emperor himself, answerable to no lord in between. Every single one of the family's enormous estates was held under someone else. So despite being one of the richest families in Europe, politically, they were locked out of the top room. I mean, think about that for a second. They had the money to buy almost anything. What they couldn't buy with ordinary land was a vote. So they did the only thing the situation allowed. They went shopping for a country. In 1699, Prince Hans Adam I bought a small lordship called Schellenberg for 115,000 guilders. 13 years later, in 1712, he bought the neighbouring county of Vaduz for 290,000 guilders. These two little patches of land on the Upper Rhine were nothing special. Poor, mountainous, sparsely populated. But they had one priceless quality. They were held directly from the emperor. Nobody stood in between. On the 23rd of January 1719, Emperor Charles VI combined the two territories, raised them to the rank of an imperial principality, and named the new little state after the family that had bought it. He did it, in his own words, in honour of his true servant, Anton Flor Ian of Liechtenstein, and that is how, to this day, Liechtenstein remains the only country on the planet named after the family that purchased it. One of the family's own businessmen would later joke that it is the only country in the world that was created through a merger and acquisition deal. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The princes didn't actually want to live there. For more than 120 years after they founded Liechtenstein, the ruling princes never even set foot in it. They ran the place like a distant investment property, while they lived in their real homes, the Grand City Palace and Garden Palace in Vienna, and their sprawling estates out in Moravia. The country existed to give the family a vote and a rank. The family's heart and its fortune was somewhere else entirely. That arrangement, the family treasure sitting far away in Bohemia and Moravia while the actual country sat empty on the Rhine, was a warning sign about where the real wealth was exposed. For 2 centuries, nobody in the family treated it as a danger. By the 19th century, the House of Liechtenstein had turned its wealth into something extraordinary, not just land, but art. The family built up what is, even now, one of the most important private art collections in the world. We are talking about somewhere around 1,600 paintings and 700 sculptures, and tens of thousands of objects in total. The largest collection of Rubens paintings still in private hands anywhere on earth belongs to this family: Rembrandt, Raphael, Van Dyck, Frans Hals. They owned the complete 8-canvas Rubens cycle, telling the story of the Roman consul Decius Mus, the only complete set of its kind still in private hands today. For a family that started by buying a country to get a vote, accumulating the finest private collection of Rubens on the planet was a fairly comfortable next step. And the land kept growing. The crown jewels of the family's property were 2 enormous estates in what is now the Czech Republic, Lednice and Valtice. Together, they formed one of the largest designed landscapes in Europe: palaces, gardens and forests stretching to the horizon. Today, that whole area is protected by UNESCO as a site of world importance. Back then, it was simply the family's backyard. Up to this point, the House of Liechtenstein had been winning for 7 straight centuries. They had survived wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires, and come out richer every time. That was about to flip. The First World War tore the old order of Europe apart. When the guns finally stopped in 1918, the map of the continent had been rewritten. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the world the Liechtensteins had lived in and served for 600 years, simply ceased to exist. New countries appeared where the old empire had been. One of them was Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia now contained the family's most valuable estates. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 1938, a young prince named Franz Joseph II made a decision that no Liechtenstein ruler had made in over 2 centuries. He packed up and actually moved to Liechtenstein. He became the first reigning prince to live full-time in the country that bore his family's name. And the same thing that had made the family powerful for centuries, their deep loyalty to the German-speaking Austrian world and their identity as German nobility, was about to become the exact reason they were destroyed. Because the timing of that move was no accident. Nazi Germany had just swallowed Austria, and the family's Czech lands now sat in the path of the coming storm. Liechtenstein stayed neutral through the entire Second World War. Tiny, tucked between Switzerland and Austria, it was never invaded, never occupied. The prince guided his little country through the deadliest conflict in human history, without losing a single citizen to enemy action. But surviving the war turned out to be the easy part. When the war ended in 1945, the new Czechoslovak government looked at the German-speaking nobility inside its borders and made a sweeping decision. Under a series of orders known as the Beneš decrees, anyone classified as German was to have their property seized. No trial, no compensation, just confiscation. The Liechtensteins were classified as Germans. In one stroke, the family lost more than 1,600 square kilometers of land in Czechoslovakia. The Lednice and Valtice estates, the forests, the farms, the castles, property that had been in the family for centuries. As I mentioned at the start, that was an area roughly 10 times larger than the Principality of Liechtenstein itself, and it represented close to 80% of everything the family owned. I mean, think about that for a second. A neutral family, from a neutral country, that never fired a shot in the war, lost the overwhelming majority of its entire fortune because of a decree about ethnicity, in a country they didn't even rule. And if that had been the only blow, the family might have absorbed it and carried on. But then a second problem closed in. A large part of the family's remaining estates, the property still left to them in Austria, sat inside the Soviet occupation zone. For a decade, until 1955, they couldn't even reach it. The land was technically theirs and completely out of their hands at the same time. So the prince, who had brought his country safely through a world war, now sat in his castle on the Rhine, head of an ancient house, watching the foundations of 700 years of wealth dissolve almost overnight. To keep the household solvent, the family began selling off the one asset they still had: art. And in 1967 came the sale that told the world exactly how far the mighty had fallen. They sold Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Ginevra de' Benci to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. The reported price was around $5 million, said at the time to be the largest sum ever paid for a single painting. It remains the only painting by Leonardo da Vinci anywhere in the entire Western Hemisphere, and it is there in an American museum because an ancient European dynasty needed the cash. If the story had stopped here, this would be a very different video. It would be one more entry in the long, sad catalogue of crowns that didn't make it. The Liechtensteins would be remembered, if at all, as the family that sold a Leonardo on the way down. And you would think the other royal houses of Europe, watching all this, would have found a way to protect themselves. Almost none of them did. They kept doing what royalty had always done. The Liechtensteins were about to do something almost no other dynasty had the nerve to try. If the fall of the Habsburgs is the thread you want to pull next, what happened to that family after their empire collapsed is its own extraordinary story, and I've told it in full. That video is on screen now, and it pairs almost perfectly with this one. But stay here first, because what the Liechtensteins did next is the part that changes everything. By the 1950s, the family had made a quiet, radical decision. If land could be taken from you with a single decree, then land was a trap. Real safety wasn't in fields and forests that any government could seize. It was in something portable, something that could move, grow, and live anywhere in the world. It was in money itself. And it just so happened that the family already owned a small bank. The bank had been founded back in 1920 and opened its doors in 1921, with 10 employees working out of the government building. For years it was a tiny, sleepy regional lender. Then, in 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, Prince Franz I stepped in and bought a controlling stake to rescue it. From that moment on, the bank belonged to the princely house. At the time, buying a struggling little bank in the middle of a global economic collapse looked like a small footnote in the family's affairs. It would turn out to be the single most important decision the dynasty ever made. Most people never heard about this part, because the family kept it quiet on purpose. The man who truly transformed that bank was the prince's grandson, Hans Adam II, born into 1945, the very year the family lost everything. He grew up watching his father sell paintings to pay the bills, and he was determined that his own children would never have to. So he did something almost unheard of for a reigning monarch. He trained as a businessman. He studied economics and business administration, and then he took the family's modest little bank and ran it like a serious financial enterprise. In 1970, the bank's shares were placed into a structure called the Prince of Liechtenstein Foundation, locking the institution to the family for the long term. Then, under Hans Adam, the expansion began in earnest. In 1989, the family bought a London-based fund manager called GT Management for £92.5 million. They took those initials, G and T, and repurposed them. In 1996, the whole group was renamed Liechtenstein Global Trust, LGT. So, the family had taken a sleepy little bank and turned it into a real international player. But what they did next made all of that look modest. Hans Adam handed the running of the bank to his second son, Prince Max, a Harvard-trained executive who had spent a decade working in private equity on Wall Street before coming home to run the family firm. Under his leadership, LGT pushed aggressively into Asia, the Middle East, and Australia. A prince's son with a Harvard MBA building a global banking empire out of a country smaller than most cities. I mean, think about that for a second. While other royal families were cutting ribbons and posing for tabloids, this family was quietly running one of the largest private banks on earth. And here is the part that makes the whole thing work. The bank is not just associated with the family. It is owned by them outright, through a chain of foundations that leads, at the very top, to one person. The reigning Prince of Liechtenstein. He doesn't sit on the board for show. He owns the institution. That total ownership, One family controlling a global bank with no outside shareholders to answer to would later put this prince in a position of power that almost no other monarch in the modern world could dream of. But to understand that, you have to understand what happened when he turned that financial independence into political muscle. Most modern European monarchs are decorative. They reign, but they don't rule. They cut ribbons, host banquets, and sign whatever their elected governments put in front of them. Hans Adam II had no interest in being that kind of prince. In 2003, he put a new constitution to the people of Liechtenstein in a national referendum. It would give the prince sweeping powers, the right to veto any law, the power to dismiss the entire government, a direct hand in appointing judges. The Council of Europe's constitutional experts, the Venice Commission, had warned that this would create what they called a monarchy with excessive personal powers concentrated in one man. International observers were alarmed. The BBC would later describe the result as the only thing close to an absolute monarchy left in Western Europe. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The prince didn't soften his proposal to win people over. He did the opposite. He told the country, in effect, that if they rejected his constitution, he would pack up, move to Austria, and convert his princely property to ordinary commercial use. The man who personally bankrolled so much of the country's prestige was willing to walk away from the throne entirely rather than be a powerless figurehead. The people sided with him. 64.3% voted yes, on a turnout of nearly 88%. In exchange, the new constitution did include one remarkable counterweight. For the first time, the citizens were given the right to abolish the monarchy entirely by referendum if they ever chose to. So it is not quite an absolute monarchy. The people could end it tomorrow. They simply keep choosing not to. You would think a population handed the power to fire their prince would use it at the first opportunity. They have done the exact opposite every single time they've been asked. It happened again in 2012. By then the prince's son, Alois, was running the country day to day as regent. When Alois announced he would veto a referendum on liberalizing abortion, activists launched a counter-initiative to strip the prince of that veto power. The country voted once more, and 76.1% of them voted to keep the prince's power exactly as it was. Hans Adam laid out his entire philosophy in a book he published in 2009 called The State in the Third Millennium. In it, he argued that a country should be run like a service company, with citizens as its customers, free to walk away if they're not satisfied. It made him a hero to libertarians around the world and a villain to his critics, who see a feudal prince dressed up in the language of modern business. So where does all of this leave the family today? Hans Adam II is still the reigning prince of Liechtenstein. Born in that catastrophic year of 1945, he is now in his 80s, and he still lives in Vaduz Castle, the fortress above the town that has been the family's home since the 1930s and is closed to the public to this day. Since 2004, his son Alois, born in 1968, has run the country as regent, handling the daily business of governing while his father remains head of state. It's the same arrangement Hans Adam's own father used with him, a careful, deliberate handover of power one generation at a time. And the bank that saved them? It is now one of the largest family-owned private banking groups in the entire world. At the end of 2025, LGT managed 386.1 billion Swiss francs in assets. In a single recent year, it reported a record group profit of around 445 million francs, the strongest result in its history, and paid a special dividend of more than 700 million francs straight to the princely house. It employs nearly 6,000 people across more than 30 locations on 5 continents. I mean, think about that for a second. A family that was selling paintings to pay its bills in the 1960s now collects a single dividend check worth more than 700 million francs. Estimates of the family's fortune vary, and the family confirms nothing. But Bloomberg's billionaire trackers have put the prince's personal wealth at around $6.2 billion in 2022, and more recently at close to $13 billion. By almost every count, that makes Hans Adam II the richest monarch in Europe. Richer than the British royal family. richer than any reigning house on the continent. And remember that Leonardo they had to sell? Hans Adam used the family's new fortune to do something his father never could. He started buying art back. Over decades, he rebuilt the princely collections into one of the great private collections in the world all over again, reversing the losses of 1945, one masterpiece at a time. But here is the part most people never hear, the detail that this whole story has been building toward. Of the 10 main royal houses left in Europe, 9 of them are funded by their taxpayers. The British monarchy receives a sovereign grant from the public purse. The Spanish, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Scandinavians, all of them, in one form or another, send the bill for their crown to their citizens. Liechtenstein is the single exception. Prince Hans Adam II takes no salary from the state. He pays for his own castles, his own staff, his own household, his own ceremonies, out of his own private fortune. In his own words, the cost of his monarchy, unlike every other monarchy, is covered entirely by the private funds of the princely family. He is, in the most literal sense, the only prince in Europe who doesn't need his taxpayers. If anything, it runs the other way. This is the family that watched the Romanovs get shot, the Kaiser flee into exile, and the Habsburgs get stripped of everything. The family that, by every reasonable measure in 1945, should have been next. And instead of joining the long list of fallen crowns, they became the one crown that never has to ask anyone for anything. We started in the spring of 1945, with a prince standing in a castle, watching his family lose almost everything, about to sell a Leonardo just to keep the lights on. Look at that same family now. The Leonardo is gone, sold to America, never coming back. But in its place stands a private bank managing nearly 400 billion francs, an art collection rebuilt from the ashes, and a prince who funds an entire country out of his own pocket while every other monarch in Europe passes the hat. The crown that everyone expected to fall didn't just survive, it outlasted and out-earned every dynasty that looked down on it. Every other family I cover on this channel lost their crown. The Liechtensteins are the ones who found a way to keep it, by learning a lesson the others never did. If you want to see the other side of that lesson, the dynasty that had everything the Liechtensteins had and lost it all. The story of what happened to the Habsburg family after their empire fell is waiting for you right now. That one's on screen. Go find out what happens to a crown when there's no bank to save it.